Hi, everyone. This is Mimi Ghez, President of Echo Communications, and you are listening to a webinar for nonprofit fundraising consultants called Grantwriters and Proposal Writers, Fundraising Consultants. Here's how you can help your clients gain footing in private donor circles across the United States. And by the end of this session, which will be about 15 minutes or so, you will know how you can help your clients as you're writing their proposals and their reports and their communications with donors, how to accent them with information about donor networks that donors often belong to that can help your clients enormously, and I hope they will. So let's get started. As I say, I'm going to scroll down. My name is Mimi Ghez, and I founded my company, Echo Communications, in 2003. And several years ago, I got interested in the case of donor networks, and I did that because I had spent about a decade doing nonprofit fundraising myself for an organization based in California. I was actually a program director, but in charge of my own fundraising as nonprofit program personnel often are. And, sort of slogged it out, raised about $1 million a year with the help of course, the executive director there. And at the end of that time, I left and had a White House fellowship and then was hired by the Open Society Institute, as it was then called, as now the Open Society Foundations, and served as a senior grant writer there for several years, about half a decade there. And what I found just blew me away. And it blew me away because I didn't know, I thought I knew it all about how foundations operate and how you go about getting a foundation money. Not at all. I didn't think I knew everything, but I knew a lot. But what I didn't know was how highly organized the donor community is and how it operates. There are private donor communities that exist. Scrolling now to the next screen. There are private donor networks that exist on just about every issue. So if you're working on healthcare issues or your client is involved in healthcare delivery of some aspect, whether it's access issues or mental health or dental care, what have you, there are the donors that care and fund these issues, care about and fund these issues, more likely than not participate in a grantmaker alliance called Grantmakers in Health, which is based in DC and has about 300 members, all of whom are donors, foundation, corporate, and major individual donors, such as Morris and Gwendolyn Cafritz Foundation, which is one of the biggest ones in DC, foundations in DC, California Endowment, and the California Wellness Foundations, which if you live in California, you recognize well as being the major givers in the healthcare arena in the foundation sense. The Colorado Trust, another very important player, and on and on. And if you are someone who cares about if you're a nonprofit in the DC area and you're trying to grow DC communities in a certain direction, healthier direction, or a more access to education direction, then you want to know that something called the Washington Regional Association of Grantmakers exists. It's a collection of 99 or so, might have changed since the last time I counted, donors, again, corporate, major individual. Actually, I don't think that they include individual members, but in any case, corporate and foundation donors who come together on a regular basis to meet and to think about issues that impact the DC community, how to fund better together, who's funding what's interesting out there. I'm just going to give you these two examples. There's countless others. There's actually 41 official issue-based donor networks that are recognized by the Council on Foundations, which is kind of the umbrella organization of philanthropy foundations. In philanthropy, it has about 1,700 members, foundation members. They have a big annual conference that attracts 1,200 foundation officials every year, including 300 foundation presidents. It's a very important body. And they help to create these issue-based foundation donor networks that I'm beginning to describe for you, like Grantmakers in Health. And there's 41 of them, and you can go to their website to understand better who the other actors are. So there's Grantmakers in Aging, there's a Funders Committee on Civic Participation. There's, as I say, just about every issue that you can think of has a Grantmaker Alliance, which the Council on Foundation was instrumental in setting up beginning in the early 1980s. And there's also an alliance of grantmakers that exists in just about every region of the country and just about every state, not every state, but many of them, like DC, which, city-state here, where I am too. And but also, Donors Forum is the one that exists for donors in Illinois, which brings together donors to discuss issues that impact that state. There's one for Arizona, and then, as I say, dozens of others. And, in some cases where states don't have them, there are regional donor alliances, like the Southeast Council on Foundation, which is a body that unifies donors in 11 Southeast states in the country. And plays a very, very important function in terms of allowing donors to understand what's important to the region, who's funding whom, and also to come up to speed in terms of any compliance issues as a foundation. It's a learning body also where they can learn about legal issues related to running a foundation. So, why do these donor networks exist? They exist because in the early days of philanthropy, there certainly were conferences and other ways that donors would get together and say, here's what we're doing. But they began to find that, at these conferences, if you're sitting down at a table and you fund education issues and you're surrounded by other people who fund maybe the environment issues having to do with the environment, or issues having to do with, let's call it recycling, or aging, or the arts, let's say, culture and the arts, that while you might have a very interesting conversation, it might be somewhat less productive than if you were at a table full of other education funders exclusively who were facing the same challenges, the same opportunities, the same kind of particular technical issues. And so that's why these very specific donor networks for specific issues and specific geographic locations began to form over time, so that donors could be even more efficient in terms of their learning and eventually in terms of their giving. So why should you care about this, as I say you should? Well, let me tell you this. It's because within each of these networks, whether it's Grantmakers in Aging or Washington Regional Association of Grantmakers or Grantmakers for Children, Youth, and Families, Grantmakers in Health, there are a variety of platforms that exist for donors to learn about the issues. So what you see on the screen now are some examples. They're different in different donor network settings, but for example, Grantmakers in Health has an audio conference series on select topics related to healthcare issues. So they invite grantees and also donors who give in particular areas to come and speak on audio conference, just as I'm speaking to you on a telephone. They might invite a grantee who's doing interesting work or a donor to come and speak on the phone to the donor members of Grantmakers in Health about that topic of interest. And the networks do surveys. They send out periodically, most of them do, send out kind of mass surveys to their members, their dues-paying donor members, to say what are what are you guys grappling with. The staff of the donor network say, what are the issues? How can we serve you better? What issues do you care about, so that we can put together educational programming that's interesting for you on who's doing what in these issues. So there is also annual conferences. You'll see is the second thing on the list here. Most of these groups have annual conferences that bring their donor members together at least once a year. There's at least one donor network that does it twice a year for educational purposes. They also run webinars like Grantmakers education, the Grantmaker Alliance for the Environment does a significant amount of work with webinars. So they invite grantees in to speak on various topics, like it could be youth, how youth are engaging around climate issues and what the impact is, and how to involve young people even more effectively in your grant making to make the biggest impact on the ground. Publications, a lot of donor networks publish thought pieces by donors and also by grantees about issues that are important to their donor members, like could be criminal justice angles that need funding or what have you. Blogs, a lot of the donor networks publish blogs that sort of put out information about who's doing what that's interesting, could be grantees. And site visits, many of the donor networks also run group site visits to go and take a look at an in-depth exploration of different issues in the field. So Grantmakers for Children, Youth, and Family just held its annual conference in El Paso in October 2012, so it's been a few months now, and they arranged a series of site visits to visit with nonprofit organizations in the area where the conference was being held in order to understand sort of border issues and immigration issues, because of course El Paso sits right on the border and this is a big issue for them. So if you're sitting there and you're thinking to yourself, I'm scrolling here so you can see the next screen, why does this impact me? I'm not a donor. I'm not even a nonprofit. I'm a grant writer and a fundraiser for nonprofits. Well, let me tell you about why this matters to you. It's because, and I'm going to scroll back now to the previous screen where I was telling you about the platforms that exist for donors within each of these networks. So not every, but on many audio conferences, in many of the annual meetings, on many of the webinars, in many of the publications, blogs, and site visits, grantees are featured. Grantees who are interesting, innovative, doing cutting-edge work in the estimation of donors are featured as speakers or as authors of think pieces that are meant to give food for thought to donors who participate in these all-donor settings. So, for example, the head of the Samulari, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Institute over in Virginia, Alexandria, Virginia, I believe it is, was invited recently by Grantmakers in Health to be one of the participants. There were 3, I believe, about wellness issues having to do with returning veterans coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, and sort of how to take a more holistic approach to wellness treatment and funding for wellness treatment. And he was a speaker on a trio of a panel of 3. Actually, it was a webinar. I apologize. It was not an audio conference. It was a webinar for donors on this topic. And he was able to speak about why this matters, why it's sort of the new wave of taking care of our men and women who go and serve overseas and in war and warlike situations. And on the call, on the webinar were, probably, I don't have a head count, but probably dozens of the hundreds of donor members of Grantmakers in Health who were listening to him speak. Now, there are very strict non-solicitation rules for a nonprofit that participates in this environment. So if you're that person, the head of Samulari Institute, you can say all you like, and they will want you to, about the issues that you represent, and you can talk about the good work of your organization, and they will want you to. But what you can't do is to make a direct ask for money in those situations. It's just the donors want to create a kind of clean learning environment for themselves pardon me, where they can understand the issues and get to know the experts and consider what the implications are for their own funding strategies in the future. That's just one example. Another would be the example of, let's look at publications. So James Rodriguez, who's, I believe his title is the Executive Director of the Fathers and Families Coalition of America, he was invited recently by, as was another organization, Families for Justice. Grace Bauer, who's a co-executive director, I believe her title is, of the Families for Justice. They were both separately invited to author think pieces about their issues for a publication put out by Grantmakers for Children, Youth, and Families called Making the Link. So it's sort of a 4-page color newsletter that goes out periodically at the suggestion of donors, donor members, to the community of member donors. So in the case of Grantmakers for Children, Youth, and Families, that would be, probably, I don't know, I haven't done a head count, but probably 300 donors that this publication went to. And these 2 individuals were able to write 4 pages about their perceptions about what needs to get funded, both in the field, in the first instance, the field of fatherhood, and the second instance, the field of kind of systems change and how to involve peer-based support in criminal justice systems. And their think piece about what they're doing and what's interesting out there went out to all of these donors. So very, very significant opportunity for these folks who were invited. And another example, Washington Regional Association of Grantmakers, they held in kind of an educational luncheon, very common, or it wasn't a luncheon, it was kind of a briefing, very, very common for their donors who care to learn about the impact of human trafficking on the DC area. So we came, I was then a member of the network, and we came together for an hour to hear the heads of 2 local DC-based organizations talk about that issue. It turns out it's quite staggering as a DC resident to learn about. And there were probably, I would say, 15, 20 donors in the room, and the 2 organizations who were, one was Fair Girls and the other was the Polaris Project. They were able to both speak for about 10 minutes about their topic and about what they do and why it's important and why donors should care about this. At the back of the room, the organization was able to lay out their business cards, their annual reports, their fact sheets, their brochures for donors to pick up as they left, which they did. So we all walked away with a kind of a bag full of information about these 2 organizations. Why does this matter? I hope you're going to hear the change in the tone of my voice when I tell you this. These are precious environments for nonprofits. For the grantee or for your client who you're writing that grant for or your proposal for or communication with a donor for, fundraising for, it's a chance for them to educate the donors in their field, not just the ones that they know and they've met with and they know of, but the collection of donors who care about their field, care enough to join an alliance of other donors who want to think together about how to fund it well, about their organization, its impact, and its current thinking. It's a place where new funding happens. Although you cannot ask for money directly at these settings, in many, many cases, too many to count, people, while they sort of finish their presentation without a direct ask, their phone begins to ring the next morning. This was the case, I don't know if it was the next morning, but this was the case for the head of the Polaris Project who spoke at the Washington Regional Association of Grantmakers I just mentioned. He received very quickly after the presentation a $10,000 contribution from one of the donor members, and he had also phone calls from others that he was working on following up with. So it's a place for potential new grants. It's a place to collect business cards from lots of people who you can call over the next, month, 2 months, 3 months, even year to cultivate a relationship with that could pan out and often does pan out, often, not right away, but over time, so that, these folks you are able to, the groups are able to engage in a dialogue that lasts into the future and where the work begins to be, of interest to the donor over time and can turn into grant making over time. And it's fundamentally also the ability, a place where you can influence the way that donors fund your issue sphere into the future. And for me, that's very exciting. When I was doing nonprofit program work and I didn't know about these networks, which is really the motivation behind the Hidden Opportunities Project, as I've called it, and you'll hear more about that in just a moment. The motivation was really that I didn't know about these things myself as a nonprofit leader, and I wish that I had. And I wish that because I was working on a set of kind of intellectual directions for the field that I was involved with that I think that the donor community needed to understand better. And I was always looking for places to educate them about what was possible, but didn't know about these networks, which is very, very common that folks don't. In fact, I'm going to read you a quote by Robert Keston, who's Executive Director of the USA Office of the People's Movement for Human Rights Learning. He said to me the other day, "I've heard of donor networks, but I do not follow them. I have never met with any of them. I know they exist, but I have no real knowledge of what issues they focus on or where they are or who the leaders of them are." And that is, I've been doing interviews with nonprofit leaders across the country for the past couple of years now, and this is no exception to the rule. Many, and I would go so far as to say the vast majority even of nonprofit leaders do not even know that these networks exist, much less that they can be the next speaker on the agenda and how much impact it can make if they are. So we've already gone over this slide. So our services. So what can we do to help you as a grant writer or a fundraising consultant to help your client come to know these networks, donor networks even better if they know them, and at all if they don't? What we will do is to develop an individually tailored coaching program just for you. You and I will sit down at our computer either via Skype or on the phone, and we will talk about the possibilities that exist for each one of your clients. This is one direction that we can go on. We could if you have a project that's already in play, like a proposal that you're writing on behalf of them, or a report that you're writing on behalf of them for the donors, for a donor of theirs, what I can do is to work with you to counsel you on language that you can develop for them that will be inserted into your report that you're writing or your proposal to the donor that will essentially say, let's pick on the Ford Foundation, okay? So say you're writing a proposal or a report back, a quarterly report to the Ford Foundation. What you want to have in there is language saying something along the lines of, thank you so much for the $250,000 that you've kindly given us towards the issue. We've been able to have thus and such impact that's been described in the report. We would love to find a way to sit down with you and explore with you all the ways that the Ford Foundation might consider additionally assisting this group, our group. I mean, if you're the fundraising consultant, it's not our, but the group, to gain visibility within donor alliances that you're a member of. And what I, Mimi Ghez, will do is to provide for you a list of all of the donor alliances that this donor pays dues to belong to, so that you know which donor networks you can mention in this report and make requests of the donor on behalf of your client to be highlighted in. So in other words, if it's the Ford Foundation, I happen to know that they're members of the International Human Rights Funders Group. which is a very large collection of funders who care about human rights issues based in New York City. So you might say something along the lines of, we know that the International Human Rights Funders Group holds an annual conference, periodic webinars, learning tours for their donors where you go to different parts of the world to meet with leaders and to understand different issues. Can we sit down with you to help craft a possible issue topic that we could present on in one of these settings? And so my role will be both to allow you to come to understand the donor networks that the donors you're working with for your client belong to, what their capabilities are, in other words, how they involve nonprofits in the first place. So do they have webinars? Do they have what kinds of private conversations are going on that involve nonprofits? I'll also help you understand what nonprofits are already being featured in your client's issue sphere on the agenda of some of these webinars and other donor education platforms. And I will help you learn to make the ask to the donor in the most appropriate way with the language that is the most donor sensitive and most, sort of so that you avoid any kind of traps in the sense of using language that they might not welcome. But that you're kind of respectful of the donor process. And this is something that I'm well aware of after having worked for half a decade and actually having placed some of these nonprofits myself into the donor alliances and been approached by people myself for funding help. I know these issues intimately well. So the coaching program will help you help your client be the one who is that speaker on the audio conference, who is that person requested, who is being requested to write the author the publication, and who is the speaker at one of their annual conference meetings. And we'll do it we will define a coaching program when we talk, and it doesn't have to, there's no sort of set package. We can do it by the hour or by the project. We will define it depending on what's on your plate. It could be, this is the second way to work together beyond just a specific project that's on your plate. The second coaching program that I offer for grant writers and fundraising consultants is to simply bring you up to speed about how you can do this on your own, how you can so that when you have a future, how can you gain knowledge about the donor networks, how to tap into them on your client's behalf, and how to be able to deliver the most powerful products to your clients in the future as a result of the knowledge and capacity that I build within you. So I would love to hear from you. Let me just give you a little testimonial here I have from the other day from Sarah Burns, who's the development director from Just Foreign Policy, after some telephone coaching we did together. She said Mimi Gez's knowledge and expertise at the nexus of the fundraising, foundation, and policy advocacy worlds makes her services unique and invaluable. So hopefully that's a testimonial that will move you to call me if you have a need for understanding these networks better and for understanding the potential of them for your clients, current and future. So you can see more about my work at www.echocommunications.net, and I'm at 202-375-0743. And the number, the email is mimi.ghez, G-H-E-Z, at echocommunications.net. I've enjoyed so much speaking with you today, and I genuinely hope to hear from you in the future. And if I don't, I genuinely hope that you've taken something out of this and that your reports and proposals in the future for your clients can be informed by this webinar in a significant way, and that you'll communicate back to me any successes that you have as a result of it. All the best and good luck.